To the outside world, Betty and Dan Broderick were the definition of the American dream couple. They had it all: wealth, status, beautiful children, and a life that many envied. Their love story began like something out of a storybook romance, but the ending would become one of the most infamous true crime cases in American history.
The Killer Podcast is a Team Woolf production.
I'm Dan. Welcome to the Killer Podcast, the show where we talk about murderers, serial killers, unsolved mysteries, and more. Don't forget to check out our social media pages and give suggestions. Season 1 has been really enjoyable to make so far, and there is a 2-part Season 1 finale starting next week where we talk about H.H. Holmes, so follow the podcast and stay up to date with the episode. In between Seasons 1 and 2 of the Killer Podcast, Team Woolf will further develop and launch through Empty Eyes, a creepy look at mysterious stories, cryptid and alien encounters, human phenomena and more, while also developing our quiz show Get Faked. Stay tuned at the end of this episode for a sneak peek at Through Empty Eyes. Betty met Dan in the 1960s when they were both young and full of ambition. She was smart, attractive, and raised in a strict Catholic family, the kind of woman expected to marry well and support her husband. Dan was charming, intelligent, and driven, with dreams of becoming a doctor. They married in 1969, and from that moment on, Betty fully embraced the traditional role of a devoted wife and mother, putting her husband's ambitions ahead of her own. For years, Betty was the backbone of their growing family, working multiple jobs to financially support Dan through medical school at Cornell University and later through law school at Harvard. She took on the stress of raising their 4 children while Dan focused on his education and career. It was exhausting, but Betty believed it was all worth it. She had sacrificed everything to ensure that Dan could achieve greatness, and once he did, she assumed they would finally enjoy the rewards together. By the time Dan completed his education, he was no longer a struggling student. He had become one of San Diego's most successful medical malpractice attorneys, raking in millions and securing a lavish lifestyle for his family. They moved into an exclusive La Jolla neighborhood, mingling with the elite and finally living the life Betty had always dreamed of. But beneath the surface, things were far from perfect. Betty had spent years believing that if she worked hard and supported Dan, their life together would be unbreakable. But what she didn't realize was that while she was raising their children and maintaining their home, Dan was slowly becoming a man she no longer recognized. Dan, now a rising star in the legal world, had transformed from a young, struggling student to a powerful attorney with influence and wealth. His success changed the balance of their marriage, giving him the upper hand while Betty's sacrifices faded into the background. He was no longer the man who relied on her to get through school. He was now a respected figure who could have anything and anyone he wanted. And soon, he did. The turning point in their marriage came in 1983, when Betty began to suspect that Dan was having an affair with his new legal assistant, Linda Kolkner. Linda was much younger than Betty, beautiful, and perhaps most painfully, the kind of woman Betty used to be before motherhood consumed her identity. At first, Dan denied everything. He insisted that Betty was imagining things, that she was paranoid and overreacting, but the signs were undeniable. He began working late more often, attending more social events without her, and emotionally distancing himself from their marriage. Whenever she confronted him, he made her feel as though she was the problem, that her suspicions were nothing more than the irrational jealousy of an aging wife. But Betty wasn't imagining things. Dan had in fact been having an affair with Linda, and despite his initial denials, he would eventually leave Betty for her. For Betty, Dan's affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was a complete destruction of everything she had built her life around. She had sacrificed her own career, her own dreams, and her youth to help Dan succeed. And now, he was discarding her for someone younger, someone who hadn't lifted a finger to get him where he was. She had built him from the ground up, and now he was throwing her away like an old business deal that no longer served him. As the months passed, the emotional turmoil turned into rage. Betty began lashing out, leaving angry voicemails, screaming at Dan in public, and even vandalizing his home. She felt powerless in a world that no longer revolved around her. And the worst part? Dan wasn't just leaving her, he was systematically destroying her. Dan used his legal expertise to manipulate the divorce process. He controlled all the finances, leaving Betty with no money and no access to their assets. He had the judge on his side, delaying the legal proceedings for years, slowly crushing her will to fight back. By the time the divorce was finalized in 1989, Dan had full custody of their children, complete control of their finances, and a new wife on his arm. Betty had lost everything, but what Dan didn't realize was that he wasn't dealing with a rational ex-wife who would walk away quietly. Betty was boiling with rage, and soon that rage would explode into something far more terrifying than angry voicemails or smashed windows. As Dan and Linda settled into their new life together, Betty's hatred grew. She had already lost her husband, her children, and her sense of identity. She felt like a ghost in her own life, watching Dan and Linda live the future that should have been hers. On November 5th, 1989, everything reached a boiling point. Betty, now consumed by revenge, entered Dan and Linda's San Diego mansion in the early morning hours. Carrying a Smith & Wesson revolver, she crept into their bedroom where the newlyweds were sleeping and fired 5 shots. Dan was hit twice in the chest, dying almost instantly. Linda, shot in the head and chest, was killed instantly. With that, Betty Broderick had crossed the line from scorned ex-wife to murderer. But the most disturbing part of all? After pulling the trigger, Betty felt no remorse. She later said, "It was over. I was free." With Dan and Linda dead, Betty didn't flee or try to cover her tracks. She turned herself in but refused to accept responsibility for what she had done. She saw herself not as a murderer, but as a woman who had been pushed too far. The public was divided. Was Betty a cold-blooded killer, or was she a victim of an abusive system that stripped her of everything? Her trial would become one of the most highly publicized in the 1990s, raising controversial questions about justice, divorce laws, and the limits of human endurance. Next, we'll explore how Betty's obsession escalated before the murders, how she justified her actions, and how the world reacted to her crimes. Because when it came to Betty Broderick, the line between villain and victim was never clear. Betty Broderick had spent nearly 2 decades supporting her husband, only to be discarded for a younger woman. She had sacrificed her own education, career, and financial independence so Dan could become one of San Diego's most successful medical malpractice attorneys. Now, with his wealth and status secured, he was systematically removing her from his life, one legal motion at a time. The divorce wasn't just an emotional battle, it was a slow, calculated destruction of everything Betty had ever known. Dan, a brilliant attorney with powerful connections, controlled every aspect of the proceedings. He delayed hearings, filed endless legal motions, and ensured Betty was left with nothing. Every time she tried to fight back, the legal system, which Dan knew how to manipulate better than anyone, shut her down. She lost her home, she lost access to money, she lost custody of her children. Betty had built Dan into a powerful, wealthy man, and now he was using that power and wealth to erase her existence. This wasn't just a divorce. This was war. The psychological toll, a woman on the edge. As the legal battle dragged on, Betty's mental state began to deteriorate, and she wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. Every moment of her life revolved around Dan and his new life with Linda. She stalked their house, repeatedly drove by in the middle of the night, and even left voicemails filled with profanity and threats. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She smashed the windows of Dan's new home in a fit of rage. She spray-painted obscene messages on his walls. She drove her car into his front door, an act of fury that would later become infamous. Instead of feeling shame or regret, Betty embraced her rage. She saw herself as a woman who had been wronged, pushed to the brink by a husband who had used her and thrown her away. Dan, for his part, wasn't just ignoring Betty, he was taunting her. He bragged about his relationship with Linda. He refused to take Betty's calls, but played her voicemails in court to paint her as unstable. He slowly reduced her financial support, forcing her into a position of dependence and desperation. Betty wasn't just fighting for money or dignity anymore, she was fighting for her very identity, and with each loss, her hatred grew deeper. By April 1989, Dan had officially won. The divorce was finalized and he had full custody of their children. Betty was legally and financially destroyed while Dan had everything, his career, his wealth, and his new wife. Betty had been completely replaced. That same month, Dan and Linda held a lavish wedding, celebrating their new life together. Linda wore a long white gown, smiling as she stood beside Dan, the same man Betty had given her entire life to. Betty wasn't just excluded from Dan's world, she was erased from it, and as she sat alone in her empty house, replaying the last 20 years of her life, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let Dan win. In the months following Dan's wedding, Betty's obsession reached its peak. She wasn't just thinking about Dan and Linda, she was planning. She began fantasizing about revenge, picturing herself finally taking control. She purchased a Smith & Wesson revolver, the same type of weapon Dan kept in his home for protection. She started telling friends that she knew what she had to do. Then, on November 5th, 1989, she acted. Divorces are rarely easy, but Betty Broderick's separation from Dan wasn't just painful, it was psychologically devastating. For years, Betty's entire identity had been built around being a wife and mother, supporting Dan while he pursued his prestigious career in law. She had no financial independence, no career of her own, and no life outside of her marriage. Everything she was, her purpose, her role, her entire existence, revolved around Dan and their children. And then suddenly, it was gone. She wasn't a wife anymore, she wasn't a full-time mother anymore, and worst of all, she had no control. It was as if her world had been ripped away, piece by piece, while she was forced to stand there and watch. And as Dan's power over her grew stronger, Betty's grip on reality grew weaker. Betty's rage didn't appear overnight. It grew, festered, and consumed her over years of what she saw as calculated emotional and financial abuse. Dan was a brilliant attorney. He understood the law, the court system, and how to manipulate it to his advantage. And Betty, having spent years as a stay-at-home mother, was completely unprepared for the legal and psychological battle ahead. Every time she lashed out, Dan turned it against her. She screamed and left angry messages, evidence of her instability. She vandalized his home, proof she was unfit to have custody. She refused to let go, more reason to shut her out completely. It was a vicious cycle. The more Betty fought back, the more Dan painted her as crazy and the more powerless she became. At times, she believed he was deliberately pushing her to insanity, knowing that if he pushed hard enough, she would break. And she did. Was Betty suffering from a personality disorder? Even today, experts debate whether Betty Broderick's actions were those of an emotionally abused woman or of someone with an undiagnosed mental illness. Some psychologists believe Betty displayed signs of borderline personality disorder, BPD, marked by extreme emotional instability, impulsivity, fear of abandonment, and uncontrollable rage. Narcissistic personality traits, obsessive need for validation, inability to accept rejection, and deep resentment toward those who wronged her. Delusional thinking, a distorted sense of reality, believing that Dan's mistreatment of her justified any action she took. One of the key indicators of BPD is an intense fear of abandonment, and Betty was abandoned in the most humiliating way possible. Her rage wasn't just about the affair, it was about being erased, replaced, and made to feel like she never mattered. She wasn't just angry at Dan, she needed revenge, obsession, control, and the final stages of psychological collapse. By 1989, Betty's obsession with Dan and Linda had completely consumed her life. She didn't date, she didn't focus on herself, and she didn't try to move on. Instead, she spent every waking moment thinking about how they had ruined her. She drove past Dan's new mansion almost every night. She broke in, destroyed his belongings, spray-painted obscenities on his walls, and left piles of dog feces in his home. She left hundreds of furious voicemails, sometimes screaming for 10 minutes straight about how he had ruined her life. She began isolating herself, withdrawing from friends and family who urged her to let go. And most disturbingly, she began to fantasize about murder. Her rage had metastasized into something unstoppable. She started telling friends she would fix the problem. She purchased a Smith & Wesson revolver, the kind of gun Dan himself kept in his home, and she began practicing how to use it. She was no longer just a scorned ex-wife. She was a woman preparing for revenge, a different era. How divorce in the 1980s was stacked against women. Divorce today is a common legal proceeding, but in the 1980s, it was still a battle for survival, especially for women who had spent their lives as homemakers. The legal system at the time wasn't designed to support women like Betty Broderick, who had sacrificed their own careers to raise children and support their husbands' success. Instead, it often left them powerless, dependent, and financially ruined, a fact that played a huge role in Betty's psychological downfall. Even though no-fault divorce laws had been introduced, men with high incomes, legal expertise, and influence, like Dan Broderick, had all the advantages, while women like Betty had almost none. Before the 1970s, getting a divorce in the US wasn't easy. A person had to prove their spouse was guilty of adultery, abuse, abandonment, or another marital offense in court to justify separation. But by the 1980s, many states, including California, had adopted no-fault divorce laws, meaning either spouse could file for divorce without needing a specific reason. While this theoretically made divorces simpler, it also weakened legal protections for financially dependent spouses, especially for women like Betty, who had no career, no income, and no real financial independence outside of her marriage. Under these laws, Dan didn't need to prove anything against Betty. He could simply leave her for Linda without legal consequences. Betty couldn't argue that she had sacrificed her career for the marriage as a means to win more assets. Wealthy, well-connected men could manipulate the legal system to get a better financial outcome, and Dan, as a top medical malpractice attorney, knew exactly how to use these laws to his advantage. How Dan used the legal system against Betty. Betty wasn't just losing her marriage, she was losing everything. Dan strategically delayed court proceedings, making it nearly impossible for Betty to move forward. He refused to pay her what she believed she was owed. He dragged out legal battles, making sure Betty ran out of money before she could get a proper settlement. He gained full custody of their children, knowing that having control over the kids gave him more power over Betty. Because Dan had money, status, and legal connections, he could afford to fight dirty. Betty, on the other hand, had no financial power, which meant she had no leverage in court. To Betty, the divorce wasn't just a betrayal, it was a rigged game that she could never win. The financial impact of divorce on women like Betty was devastating. Studies in the 1980s showed that women's standard of living dropped by an average of 73% after divorce, while men's standard of living increased by 42%. Women who had been stay-at-home mothers often struggled to re-enter the workforce, especially if they had been out of work for over a decade. Alimony laws were inconsistent, meaning wealthy men often found ways to pay as little as possible. Betty had spent nearly 20 years supporting Dan, working low-paying jobs while he finished medical school and law school, all while raising their children. And yet, when the marriage ended, the court saw Betty as just another divorcee, not a woman who had been an equal partner in building Dan's success. Instead of being rewarded for her sacrifices, she was left with nothing while Dan moved on with his new wife, Linda Colcana, and continued living a life of luxury. For Betty, this wasn't just unfair, it was unbearable. Was Betty justified in feeling trapped, or was she unwilling to move on? Divorce laws in the 1980s were undeniably biased against homemakers, but at the same time, Betty's reaction was extreme. Many women in her position rebuilt their lives, pursued new careers, and moved forward despite their losses. Betty, however, became obsessed with Dan and Linda, not just emotionally, but psychologically. Instead of trying to rebuild her life, she spent years stalking, harassing, and vandalizing Dan's home, even when she could have focused on healing. This raises the ultimate question. Did divorce laws in the 1980s fail Betty, pushing her to a mental breakdown? Or did Betty refuse to let go of her privileged lifestyle, using the system as an excuse for her inability to move on? This is where public opinion was divided, because while the legal system certainly played a role, Betty wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for revenge. Next, we'll explore how Betty justified the murders, how the media painted her, and how two separate trials would change her fate forever. Because in Betty's mind, she wasn't the villain, she was the victim. When police arrived at Betty Broderick's home, they didn't find a woman hiding in guilt or attempting to flee. Instead, they found a woman eerily calm and composed, as if she had finally lifted the weight of years of rage and frustration off her shoulders. She didn't resist, she didn't deny it, she simply surrendered herself and admitted exactly what she had done. I had no choice. He pushed me to this. It was the only way I could make him stop. There were no tears, no signs of emotional distress, just a woman who believed she had done what was necessary. When investigators asked if she regretted it, her answer was chilling. I guess I could have just shot myself. That would have been the easy way out, but why should I be the one to go? She wasn't sorry, she wasn't broken, and soon the world would be divided on whether she was a monster or a woman pushed too far. By the time Betty Broderick's trial began in 1990, the case had already become a media sensation. This wasn't just a murder trial, this was a divorce trial that had ended in bloodshed. On one side, you had those who saw Betty as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who couldn't let go of the past, who refused to move on, and who murdered two innocent people in their sleep out of spite. On the other, you had those who saw her as a victim, a woman who had been psychologically tormented for years, stripped of everything and driven to the edge by a powerful ex-husband who manipulated the system against her. Women's rights activists saw Betty's case as a symbol of systemic oppression. Divorce in the 1980s was often brutal for women, especially when wealthy, influential men controlled the legal proceedings. Many believed Dan had gaslit, emotionally abused, and financially crushed Betty until she snapped, but others saw a dangerous precedent. If Betty Broderick could murder her ex-husband and his new wife and get away with it, would that justify revenge killings in every bitter divorce? This wasn't just a murder case. This was a national debate about power, privilege, and justice. Betty's legal team didn't deny the facts. She had pulled the trigger, she had fired the shots, and she had killed Dan and Linda in cold blood. But they wanted the jury to understand why she did it. Her lawyers painted her as a woman who had been systematically destroyed by her husband. He stripped her of financial security. He took her children away. He humiliated her with a younger woman. He manipulated the courts and used his legal power to ensure Betty had no voice, no rights, and no hope of ever winning. They argued that this wasn't about hatred, it was about a woman who had reached her breaking point. Betty herself took the stand, showing no remorse but plenty of anger. He stole my life. He controlled everything. He left me with nothing and expected me to sit there and take it. She never apologized for the murders. Instead, she insisted that Dan and Linda had it coming. It was a dangerous defense, one that some jurors sympathized with while others were horrified by. The prosecution had one job, to prove that Betty was not a victim but a murderer. And they had plenty of evidence to back them up. They played the threatening voicemails Betty left Dan weeks and months before the murders, where she screamed about how he ruined her life, how she would make him pay, how she wasn't going to let him win. They presented witness testimony from friends and family who warned Betty was becoming more unhinged, that she had fantasized about killing Dan for months, and that she had purchased a gun with full intent to use it. The most damning piece of evidence? Betty had brought a revolver with her that night. She entered their home uninvited in the middle of the night. She walked into their bedroom, where they were sleeping. She stood over them and fired 5 times, and when Linda tried to move, she shot her in the head, execution style. This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment killing. This wasn't self-defense. This was premeditated murder, and Betty wasn't the victim, she was the villain. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the jury couldn't come to a unanimous decision. Some jurors believed Betty had suffered years of emotional and financial abuse, which led to her mental instability. Others believed murder was murder, no matter how justified she thought she was. After days of deliberation, the trial ended in a mistrial, with the jury deadlocked at 10-2 in favor of conviction. The second trial began in 1991, and this time, there was no debate. Betty Broderick was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She was shocked, believing she would walk free, but the law saw her for what she was, a woman who had made a deliberate choice to kill. Since her conviction, Betty Broderick has never shown remorse. At every parole hearing, she refuses to admit she was wrong. She still insists that Dan and Linda deserved what happened, and because of that, she will likely never be released from prison. Betty may have felt free the moment she pulled that trigger, but in the end, she traded one prison for another, one of her own making. She spent years fighting for control, and in the end, she lost everything. And to this day, the question remains, was Betty a monster, or was she a victim of a system that pushed her too far? Because depending on who you ask, the answer is still up for debate. A crime that captivated America. The Betty Broderick case wasn't just another crime story, it became a cultural phenomenon. From the moment Betty fired those 5 shots on November 5th, 1989, the public was obsessed. The story had everything: wealth, betrayal, courtroom drama, and a scorned ex-wife who refused to show remorse. But what made this case truly legendary was how it transcended true crime and became a permanent part of pop culture. It wasn't just a murder trial. It became a symbol of gender roles, divorce wars, and the dark side of the American dream, and Hollywood took full advantage of it. Long before the era of Netflix true crime documentaries, Betty Broderick's story became one of the most famous TV movie sagas of the 1990s. A Woman Scorned, The Betty Broderick Story, 1992. One of the most watched TV movies of all time. Starring Meredith Baxter as Betty, it turned her into a larger-than-life villain. Baxter's chilling portrayal of Betty as cold, calculating, and completely unremorseful was so powerful that she earned an Emmy nomination. Her final fury, Betty Broderick, The Last Chapter, 1992. A sequel to the first movie, this one followed her trial, conviction, and life in prison. It reinforced Betty as both a tragic figure and a terrifying one, someone who had been wronged but had gone too far. These movies cemented Betty Broderick's place in true crime history, making her a household name long after the trial ended. But Hollywood didn't stop there. TV series and documentaries, The Story That Won't Die. Even decades after the murders, Betty's story refuses to fade. Dirty John, The Betty Broderick Story, 2020, Netflix USA Network. A modern retelling of the case starring Amanda Peet as Betty and Christian Slater as Dan. Unlike the 1990s movies, this version was more sympathetic to Betty, portraying her as a woman destroyed by an unfair system. It sparked new debates. Was she a victim of emotional abuse, or a woman who simply refused to move on? Betty has been featured in multiple true crime shows, each taking a slightly different stance. Some portray her as a calculating murderer, while others highlight the legal and psychological factors that pushed her over the edge. The constant retelling of her story proves that Betty Broderick isn't just a criminal, she's a true crime legend. But it wasn't just Hollywood that kept Betty's story alive. Betty herself made sure she was never forgotten. One of the most chilling aspects of Betty Broderick's story is that she has never expressed regret. From prison interviews to parole hearings, she has remained defiant, insisting that Dan pushed her to kill him. Her lack of remorse has played a huge role in her repeated parole denials. In her most recent parole hearing, 2017, Betty was once again denied early release, with the board stating that she still blames Dan for everything and refuses to take responsibility. She remains one of the most famous female killers in US history, a woman who still believes she was the real victim. And that is what makes her case so unique. Most convicted killers fade into obscurity, but Betty Broderick refuses to let the world forget her. Even after 3 decades, people still debate whether Betty Broderick was justified in what she did. Was she a victim of an unfair divorce system, manipulated and gaslit until she snapped? Or was she a narcissistic, controlling woman who refused to accept reality? The answer depends on who you ask. Her story changed how America viewed divorce. It exposed how powerful men could manipulate the legal system while also showing the extreme consequences of unchecked rage and entitlement. In the end, Betty Broderick became more than just a killer. She became a cautionary tale. Now, as promised, here is a sneak peek at the upcoming first season of Through Empty Eyes. The name The Third Man comes from Sir Ernest Shackleton, the legendary Antarctic explorer who, in 1916, survived one of the most harrowing survival ordeals in human history. He and his men were starving, freezing, and lost in one of the most hostile places on Earth. And yet, as they made their desperate escape through the glaciers of South Georgia Island, Shackleton swore he felt someone else walking with them. The men were exhausted, hallucinating, barely alive, and yet the third man was always just behind them, moving with them as if guiding their every step. It didn't speak, but it radiated calm, intelligence, and purpose. Shackleton later wrote, "I have no doubt that we were 4, not 3. Stay tuned to our social media for the upcoming first season of Through Empty Eyes, so if you like that, you'll love the story of Ernest Shackleton and the Third Man Effect. The Killer Podcast is a Team Woolf production. Unless otherwise stated, neither myself nor my guests are experts in the topics discussed. While I strive to present well-researched and accurate information, mistakes can happen. If you catch an error or have additional insights, I encourage polite discussion in the comments. Each episode is produced, directed, narrated, and edited by me, with proofreading by my better half, Tina, who makes sure I don't completely lose the plot. If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining us on social media, links below to explore more content and stay connected. You'll also find resources and reference links in the show notes if you'd like to dig deeper into the case on your own. I'm Dan, and thanks for listening to the Killer Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and never stop asking questions.
The Killer Podcast is a Team Wolf production.